Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chan Teoh from the Department of Chinese Studies at the National University of Singapore. On behalf of the co-organizers, which comprises the Wan Boo Sow Research Center for Chinese Culture of my home department and the Singapore Chinese Culture Center, I welcome all of you here to attend the second Wan Boo Sow Lecture of 2022. By engaging subject experts with vast experience in higher education and research, we hope that the lecture series will promote general interest and knowledge transfer in the realms of Chinese culture, literary arts, and history. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Karen Teoh as our speaker. Dr. Teoh is a historian focusing on Chinese migration and diaspora across China and Southeast Asia from the 18th to the 20th centuries. She held positions at Stonehill College as Associate Professor of History, Bowdoin College, and Northeastern University. She's the author of Schooling Diaspora, Women, Education, and the Overseas Chinese in British Malaya and Singapore, 1850s to 1960s, which is published by Oxford University. She received her PhD from Harvard University. Dr. Teoh will deliver a lecture for an hour, which will be followed by a Q&A session. Before we begin, please switch off your phones or turn on their silent modes. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Teoh, whose talk is entitled, Home is That Which I Adore, Nation, Diaspora, and the Education of Overseas Chinese Women. Dr. Teoh, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to Dr. Chan for that kind introduction. And then also, I want to just express my gratitude to the Department of Chinese Studies at NUS and the Singapore Chinese Cultural Center, also to the Girls' Schools alumni groups that have helped to bring me here today. I'm very grateful. And also, I appreciate all of you for being here during the holidays and on a weekend afternoon when surely there are other things to do. Before I plunge into my talk, can I just see a show of hands? How many of you here are attending or have attended girls' schools? Not bad. How many of you have family members who have attended girls' schools? It's good representation. Okay, thank you. I'll tell you a little bit more about my experience in them later on. So as you can see, my talk today is titled Home is That Which I Adore, Nation, Diaspora, and the Education of Overseas Chinese Women. That's the title of the entire book, which I will not try to cover in the following hour, but I'd like to just focus on one small piece of it. And I'd like to start by posing a deceptively simple question. What is home? What is home? Is it about place? Is it about geography? Is it about people, the people you love or are related to? Is it about language, culture, cultural practices? Is it about politics, citizenship, official, non-official belongings? And perhaps one aspect of home that people don't talk about as much because it is not commonly thought about. Once claimed, under what circumstances can home be taken away from you? Okay? So the question of home, of belonging really, lies at the heart of the historical episode that I'd like to explore today. It comes out of my book, Schooling Diaspora, which is a history of girls' schools and ethnic Chinese communities in British Malaya and Singapore. It looks at how formal education, girls' schools, shaped women's national and transnational identities during a time when much of the public sphere was dominated by men and male interests. So a little bit of the personal side note that I mentioned earlier, I do have a vested interest, I suppose, in the topic or how I came to it. I'm from Malaysia. I grew up in Kuala Lumpur. And as a young child, I attended Methodist kindergarten. The Methodists were one of the early missionaries establishing schools in the region. For primary school, I attended a Chinese co-ed primary school called Kun Cheng, which is one of the first Chinese schools also in Malaya, one of the first girls' schools, Chinese girls' schools there as well. And then eventually I came to Singapore, where I was lucky enough to spend 6 years studying in your fine education system at Raffles Girls' Schools and then at Raffles Junior College. All throughout, of course, I had friends, I had classmates, I had relatives, women who had also attended these institutions. So my mother, for example, attended the convent Seremban, grew up in Malaysia. So with all these connections, it felt like, both an advantage, but also sometimes a little bit of a barrier. An advantage because obviously I used alumni connections and personal insight to try and get at some of these stories. A little bit of a barrier because sometimes I had to remind myself I had to step back in order to be able to take an intellectual and historical perspective. Okay, so that's the sort of background to all of this. But let's come back to this concept of home, and let's start with something like home, very personal and individual. So on the screen in front of you, you see an excerpt from a letter written by a young Chinese woman running away from home, from Penang, Malaya in 1939. I'd like you to maybe pay attention to and remember the essence, if not the exact wording of this letter. There is a strong sense of emotion, powerful emotion running through it. And of course, I draw the title of this talk today, and indeed one of the chapters of my book, from a line here: home is that which I adore. It's a little bit of a clumsy construction, grammar-wise, as I was trying to translate this from Chinese into English. In Mandarin, it's 家是我所爱的. So home is that which I love, that which I adore. And she's saying that, you know, she's powerfully drawn to home. She understands that she is shedding her responsibility as a daughter, a filial daughter to her parents, but she's going to go because the ancestral homeland has a greater call on her than the responsibilities of her individual family. In terms of rhetoric and style, I find that there are a couple of things going on here. One is, again, that powerful emotionality, but it's theatrical. Right? This letter begs to be read aloud, you know, to an audience on the stage. It feels like there's an audience for it. So perhaps some of this language was acquired or learned, right, in a political discourse. This is the way that young activists might speak at the time. The second is how this as a letter could have been written by a young woman or a man. Right? Because you also had this same sense of a child leaving, dropping their responsibilities to go off and serve the homeland, but more typically, this might be something that people would be used to seeing from a male voice than a female one in 1939. The author of this letter is someone named Bai Xueqiao, whose story and letter acquired such fame that both are preserved in China's state archives. So in 1939, aged 25, she left her upper middle class home in Penang to undertake a hazardous trip to China, which was then at war with Japan. Now, of course, her parents would not allow her to make such a journey, so she had to make her preparations in secret. She actually hid her clothing, right? She packed her suitcases effectively in a friend's house, and she used a fake name to sign up for a men's engineering corps that was traveling from Penang to China to join the war effort. On the day of the departure, according to the story, her father discovered her plans and desperately tried to stop her, but he couldn't change her mind. She was so determined. According to biographical accounts, for several hours before her ship set sail, quote, father and daughter sat silently face to face, unable to speak for sorrow, unquote. Several of her classmates from her all-girls school also showed up at the dock to speed her on her way. So she had been a student in these girls' schools, and her friends knew of her plans, and they came to say goodbye and to wish her good luck. Off she went to China. Bai Xueqiao's experiences would later include returning briefly to Penang from China to work as a teacher and as a principal of an all-girls school, being arrested by the British colonial administration for communist activities. More specifically, in 1949, with the Chinese Revolution having taken place, she secretly commissioned a flag, what would be the PRC's new flag, and then she raised it on the grounds of her girls' school, which is kind of like a signal, you know, come arrest me. So she was detained in a camp for over a year, and then finally she was deported to China, where her career and her reputation flourished. So on the left, you actually see a photograph from a newspaper article because they decided to profile her life and her experience. So that's her as a young woman. And then on the right is a photograph that I took of her when I was lucky enough to meet her as part of my research for this book and interviewing women who had attended girls' schools. So Bai Xueqiao was part of a striking phenomenon that appeared in British Malaya and Singapore, indeed across Southeast Asia from the 1940s to the 1960s. And during this time, ethnic Chinese youth from these colonies left their homes for an uncertain future, returning, in inverted commas, so to speak, to a place they had never seen in order to help build a nation to which they felt they belonged. One important trait many of them shared was a common educational background. That is, they had studied in Chinese language schools in Southeast Asia. And just to give you a sense of the numbers, between 1949 and 1970, the number of these returnees swelled to an estimated 500,000, 500,000. These are some images from 1964. Again, these are meant for public consumption, and so they portray a very positive image of these returnees on campuses, university campuses, because that was one of the natural landing places for them, right? Students here, students there, and then working together, studying, helping to become useful to the nation in the 1960s. Then and now, commentators often refer to these remigrants as returning sojourners. Right? The Chinese term is 归侨, returning sojourners. This label suggests, rather misleadingly, that these individuals were only temporarily abroad if they were sojourning, and that China was a permanent homeland to which return was inevitable. Now, there are no perfectly accurate terms for describing this population. I actually think it's fascinating that we still struggle to this day to find a term to describe people who migrate and remigrate, who are transnational in their sense of belonging, and no one term, I think, can be agreed upon by everyone, and that alone is significant, I think. But in this case, people have used words like returnee, returned overseas Chinese. Again, that could be inaccurate because some of these individuals were born and bred outside of China. Remigrant also is not totally accurate because some of these individuals may have had parents who migrated, but they themselves were born and bred in their parents' adopted homelands. So for example, in Malaya or Singapore, Penang, for example. Okay, so there are all these controversies over the terminology, including, if we back up for a second, the whole field of overseas Chinese studies, the term Chinese diaspora, which is in the title of my talk. It just tells us that even to this day, it's no simple thing to be an ethnic Chinese person living outside of China, right? And I think it's useful to ask ourselves why. Certainly in the mid-20th century, an aura of permanent foreignness seemed to cling to this population even upon their arrival in China. For now, for this talk, I'll use the term remigrant just for the sake of convenience, but I want to acknowledge that it's a troubled and perhaps controversial word. Now, despite their large absolute numbers, remigrant youth were a relative minority, right, relative to the population here in Southeast Asia. After more than 500 years of migration to and settlement throughout the region, not to mention throughout the world, ethnic Chinese people had sunk roots where they had landed, right, 落地生根, so to speak. And these Chinese had formed new communities that acculturated and assimilated to their adopted and sometimes now permanent homes. Within this population, until recently, relatively little has been known, has been researched in a scholarly fashion about the girls and women. Compared to their well-studied male counterparts, female migrants or remigrants seem to be ciphers on the historical record. Who are these women who defy the gender conventions of their time? How did they decide to move to China during such a turbulent era, a dangerous time, right, to be moving internationally? And what were the consequences of these actions? What happened to them? And as many of them seem to have been politically influenced by their experiences in Chinese girls' schools, are they the ultimate success story for institutions that were supposed to, rumored to be, hotbeds of political activism, trying to inculcate diasporic nationalism? And given the dramatic, striking nature of their adventures, why is it that they seem to have gone quite unnoticed on both sides of their journeys, sending and receiving ends? Bai Shutiao's story is actually very much an exception. Well, part of the explanation, as you can imagine, lies in the reception that they received in China. They were initially hailed by the communist government as patriots and contributors to the new post-1949 society. But in later decades, they fell prey to growing hostility and persecution, in fact, because of their supposedly bourgeois backgrounds and links to foreign countries. At the base of all this was not just an implication, but an outright charge that they were lacking an authentic Chineseness. They were insufficiently Chinese. This is, of course, the ultimate irony, because for the returning youth, for these returnees or remigrants, their transnational circumstances, right, the transnational circumstances of their upbringing, their schooling, and so on, and their effort to assert a kind of ultimate belonging rendered them inauthentic. Okay, and this was not something that was within their control. So, just backing up for a little bit also, I want to give everyone a little bit of framework and context for what I'm doing here. Obviously, I cannot touch on every single one of these catchwords. Every single one of them would have a lot of unpacking to do. But I put this up here just to illustrate that the story of educated Chinese women can show how the transnationalism of diaspora can both expand but also severely restrict the flexibility of an individual in their identity construction. Right? This goes a little bit against the grain in traditional overseas Chinese studies. I do think that, I wrote this book, I started writing it more than 10 years ago. By now, I think the field has moved on a little bit. But certainly in earlier times, and in some people's minds, overseas Chinese communities, migrant communities, in fact, seem to be characterized by hybridity, flexibility, right? We know that identity is something that is constructed, that is fashioned, and you have these global transnational populations, so it seems to be this very fluid kind of population and identity form. Unusual as the case before us may be, this case that I'm going to be talking about of the Chinese women who returned to China, I think it offers some insight into how, within this supposedly flexible and fluid community, you still have individuals, such as these women, who are not once, not twice, but thrice marginalized, as migrants, as an ethnic minority, and as women. Right? Living with uncertain political status in a British colony and making difficult choices to negotiate their subject positions. And then trying to escape the restrictions of colony, found that nation, and in fact the ethno-cultural definition of nation made it difficult for them as well. Now, in most national histories, and actually even today, the idea of an immigrant homeland is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can provide a positive sense of identity, right? Something that people can rally around. Even if people have migrated from somewhere else, they might share a common culture, language, tradition, and that gives them a certain kind of stability, something to rally around. On the other hand, it is also clearly seen as an obstacle to full integration into their adopted nation, because it is an alternative locus of attention and loyalty beyond the country's borders. I'm now based in the US, that's where I work and live for the most part, although my heart is still in Southeast Asia. And in the US, I'm often struck by these cases of people who are deported from the US for certain crimes. It's found that they have illegal immigrant status, for example, but the difficult truth of this is that some of these people, especially if they're young, were born and bred in the US. And so they get deported to a, quote, home country, right, where their parents came from, and they have no family, they have no home, they may not speak the language or know the culture, they are literally caught between these two places. US throws them out, the other country has to take them in, but these individuals are just floating, kind of lost. Somebody I know actually is writing a book about that and has titled it Diaspora. So that's another interesting interpretation of what that means. Another thing to think about here is how we have this conception of the overseas Chinese, not just in Southeast Asia or in certain countries, but around the world. There's this term of the essential outsider that has been applied to them. Okay, it refers to populations that, for whatever reason, however many generations they have been somewhere, are still sometimes seen as never quite totally belonging, that there's a very powerful pull on their loyalties from outside wherever they have settled. What I'd like to show here is that this term and this framework can also be applied even within the overseas Chinese community or within the Chinese world itself, right? So it's not just inter-ethnic conflict, but intra-ethnic conflict that divides them. So just a few quick notes on terminology, which I think most folks here would already be familiar with. As you can see, I use the terms ethnic Chinese, overseas Chinese, Chinese diaspora, again, acknowledging that they are sometimes problematic. This is usually something that I put up when I give talks to non-Asian audiences, but just to clarify that I use the terms Malaya and Singapore, which map to today's entities, Peninsula, Malaysia, and Singapore. And I kind of talk about these regions as a unit because they were grouped administratively during British colonial rule. And then, of course, Malaya independent in 1957, renamed Malaysia in 63, Singapore and Malaysia separate in 65. So we're all familiar with that. Now, for the rest of my talk, I'd like to divide things into two parts. First, I'm going to give a quick sketch history of English and Chinese girls' schools in Malaya and Singapore, and come back to this idea of return migration. And then second, look a little more closely at these women's experiences. Okay? So again, some quick and vastly oversimplified historical context that many of you probably already know. By the early to mid-19th century, the British had established a reasonably strong, if not ironclad grip over its settlements in Malaya and Singapore. And of course, in the mid-19th century, a combination of push and pull factors led to a new surge of Chinese migration to Southeast Asia. All right, as mentioned, this migration had been happening for hundreds of years already. So more than ever, you have this growing population of ethnic Chinese who intermarried, settled down with their families, and eventually began to think about how best to raise their children and position themselves in this colonial environment. So this is the background, the backdrop against which I started to look at girls' schools. And just to give you an idea of some of the materials that I began to uncover, some really fascinating photographs and literal glimpses into life at the time. It was during the mid-19th century that girls' schools began to appear in Malaya and Singapore. And we start with the mission girls' schools. It was missionaries who first established these institutions. Many of them, of course, still exist today. The earliest one in the region, both in Malaya and Singapore, the Catholic Convent of the Holy Infant Jesus, founded by sisters from the Holy Infant Jesus Order. And it had various branches throughout Malaysia and Singapore that still exist. You have Protestant schools such as St. Margaret's, St. Mary's, Methodist Girls, so on and so forth. And then following very closely after the mission schools were government-sponsored secular schools, Raffles Girls' School being one of them. Towards the 1900s, so maybe we're talking about 4 to 5 decades later, you then begin to see an upsurge in Chinese language or Chinese medium girls' schools founded by the ethnic Chinese community themselves, and they had their own network of these institutions. Just as a side note, this is an interesting thing to think about. For a while, they actually outpaced the convent schools in terms of enrollment. So there are just some really interesting features demographically in that history. Now, how is it that I came to this particular project, to this question on girls' schools? Just as a little bit of a detour, as I was researching overseas Chinese history, some of you may know this history is very much full of stories of ethnic conflict, ethnic identity construction, and so on. So I was constantly bumping up against these narratives that were really well established, right? Migration patterns, economic or business histories, ethno-racial tensions. And as I was sort of swimming through all of this in graduate school, someone asked me, where are the women? Where are the girls and women? The women, of course, were right there, but they couldn't necessarily be found easily on the historical record, on paper sources, right? Where they did show up when I did my research was as typically as victims of oppression, sexual violence, as a quiet, unseen minority in a patriarchal community. So you did have certain books that looked at these unusual women, right? This is one end of the social scale. At the other, you might have very privileged, very well-to-do women, the wives of community leaders, of Song Ong Xiang, Lim Boon Keng, and so on. So those women, you would know their names, you would know their actions, but that was very unusual. Sandwiched in between those two extremes, right? What about all of those other people? So this is where I started to wonder, what if we look at one of the very few public locations where girls could actually go, right? If they were meant to be home, and if you had all these strictures that they were supposed to grow up to be wives and mothers, housewives, and so on, was there anywhere else they could go that might have records? And I suppose this is where personal experience comes in, because you realize that in a girls' school is a girls' world, right? That's where the girls are students. The teachers then, and actually now too, tend to be largely women. And you also have paper records that get generated. There's a whole bureaucracy on that. And you have, what we would today call like a Ministry of Education. You had inspections and so on. And the British colonials were quite manic about generating reports. So you might have documentation there. So that's where I started to look. And it turned out to be a very rich source. This is where girls and women were not only present, but also keepers of their own histories, because they authored the school magazines, they wrote in the school annals, they kept the attendance records, they did the hiring and so forth. So this just opened up a whole new world. And if I could back up for a moment, again, these are some images that I found in the annals, in the school history of the Holy Infant Jesus, sometimes from magazines, sometimes from their archives. So as you can see, these schools provided for not only the daughters of well-to-do families who could pay the school fees, but they also attended to the sick, to the poor, to orphans, and so on. Right, here's another image of the sisters with orphans in Penang. As I read one of the school histories, it was fascinating to see that these nuns in their very heavy dresses and heavy habits had to get used to the hot climate in Southeast Asia while they were in Europe. And so they would wrap themselves in wool blankets and sleep every night and just kind of like get used to sweating a lot so that they could adapt when they got here. This is an interesting image of a needlework lesson. This will be relevant when we talk about what these schools taught later on. But as you can see, you still have a very much Peranakan kind of population, the little babas, nyonyas, sorry, in their Peranakan dress and practicing needlework. And this is a format we're all familiar with, the class photo, right? So there they are. And some things are just timeless. Some of the expressions on these girls' faces I can totally see still today. Okay? So that's just a quick run through the English schools history, which I will not talk too much about today, but it begins to give us an idea, because when we compare this to how the Chinese schools came about, you can start to see that there's a pretty powerful cultural difference. The language of education was different, English versus Chinese, right? There would be a religious orientation in the convent schools that was absent in the Chinese schools. In the latter, you had much more of a focus on the political, right? On civic education. The idea that these young women were to be instructed not just to grow up to become obedient wives or ideal mothers, but to be contributors to a new nation, okay? So you have a very different orientation. English schools came to be associated with colonial domination, while Chinese schools were associated with stick-in-the-mud traditionalism. Each side kind of looked askance at the other, and you began to have this split within the overseas Chinese community. Neither trope, of course, is completely accurate, but as we know, perceptions sometimes matter most. So this is where I shift to the Chinese girls' schools, which began to appear in colonial Malaya and Singapore, as I mentioned, at the turn of the 20th century. Now, their appearance was linked to political and social changes taking place in China at the time. Reformers and revolutionaries were trying to revive a faltering dynastic state. They were looking for new ways to become modern, and one of these ways was through the emancipation and education of girls and women. So this line of thinking and this development, of course, spread into the overseas Chinese community as well. Nanyang Girls High School, in fact, one of the founders, at least on paper, was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. So you can begin to see that there are actually connections between the reformers and eventually revolutionaries in China and here. Now, these schools, as I said, were consciously modeled along Western lines, but with a Chinese cultural orientation. So what this means is that school was, they gave subject areas, right, in the curriculum. You would have mathematics, geography, history, language, and so on, not just a traditional memorization of Confucian texts. And this is an interesting tidbit. Thinking about the sewing lesson that you saw earlier, Chinese girls' schools tended to focus on non-gender specific curricula. What that means in plain English is that they did not offer domestic science, they didn't offer home economics, they didn't teach needlework, they didn't teach what English schools would call mother care or the care of infants and children. So this was a rather striking difference, right? There was a deliberate turn away from the so-called domestic arts to focus on skills and information that would serve a civic kind of individual, right? So these are just some images that I will quickly page through just to give you a sense of the kinds of materials that I came across and that have been helpful in informing this history. I thought it was so fascinating how these pages gave the lie to this idea that, you know, girls' schools were still very traditional, that the girls had to be, you know, very demure, that parents were reluctant to send their girls because they thought their chastity or purity would be damaged. Certainly there was that kind of thinking early on, but once you open these magazines, you find a very dynamic, literally, picture. You see girls throwing the javelin, running track, you had swimming clubs, badminton clubs, you had student government, you had volunteer organizations, you had student groups who would come together and write petitions that they would send to the government demanding better facilities for something. So, you know, you kind of see this tension because these schools continue to stress certain conventions of female behavior, right? Morality, ultimately, they could go out of the home to work, but only for certain kinds of jobs. Teaching and nursing were considered proper occupations for women, not too much more than that in the beginning. Right? So it's an interesting backdrop against which to look at all this. So I'd like to then put these two parts together, English schools, Chinese girls' schools, and think about what this means when you consider what's happening at the time in China. Right? As China transitioned from Republican and then to communist governments, they continued to make an effort to harness the loyalties of the overseas Chinese, not just because it would serve them ideologically, but it would also serve them financially. They wanted donations, right? They wanted participation, they wanted support. And so to attract some of these young overseas Chinese, the government instituted special policies, such as work and housing assistance and preferential school policies. So for example, if you were a young person taking entrance exams to get into a university in China, you would get extra points added to your score, okay? Now, overseas Chinese youth, of course, finding themselves disaffected, perhaps, in their colonial environment, trying to find a way to belong, heard this call and felt, you know, very much roused to action. So I'm going to skip ahead just to show you some of these images from what they called overseas Chinese newspapers, published in China, but deliberately oriented towards an overseas Chinese audience and distributed outside of China, right? And so it would contain photographs of overseas Chinese youth happily working on farms, attending university, basically participating and supporting the new nation. So again, we don't have reliable statistics on how many of these Chinese remigrants were female, but as I was interviewing some of these women and asking them about, you know, who went back to China, some of them said that pretty much every single weekend they would go to the train station or to the docks to bid their classmates farewell. So we don't know the numbers necessarily, but we know that it was recurrent enough a pattern that it was a known thing. Overwhelmingly, the women who did participate in remigration were from the Chinese girls' schools. This was virtually unheard of amongst the English-educated girls and women. Upon their arrival in China, things did not necessarily go smoothly for the remigrants, as I mentioned earlier. Things like the special policies, the extra points in the exams, all those things had already engendered some resentment, right, from the Chinese in China itself. So as politics began to shift in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and certainly as you get into the Cultural Revolution years from the 1960s onwards, returned overseas Chinese came in for a lot of criticism. They were considered useful but not trustworthy. This was something I heard from my interviewees. It was just a phrase that they used a lot, 可用不可信, right? They were handy, but you couldn't necessarily trust them to be loyal. Some of them were sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. They had to be very careful not to exchange letters with or be in contact with their family in Southeast Asia because that was politically suspicious. And so ultimately, these individuals were found to be wanting in their Chineseness and in their revolutionary qualities because they came from bourgeois class backgrounds. Many came from middle class merchant backgrounds. Many of them, interestingly, did not speak such great Chinese compared to their Chinese counterparts. And so they actually had to take remedial Chinese lessons. And this became, a subject of derision and eventually contempt from the Chinese. In the end, the special treatment that they received became something that was used against them, and not for all, but for many. Theirs was not a pleasant experience. So in light of this background history, we ask ourselves, Bai Shetiao's story, what do we think about it? Right? It's an ideal narrative of a revolutionary citizen, young person, call to action, responds, goes, does great, right? She doesn't just leave Malaysia, she is kicked out by the British, right? Her defiance leads her back, and she sacrifices the comforts of a home in Southeast Asia for the perils of wartime China. And she lives to a ripe old age, and she has a very successful career. That's great, right? That's a very smooth narrative. It fits well. But now we know that this is highly unusual, right? This narrative has been polished to a high sheen. What about all of the others that were not captured in the archival record? What about those who suffered a little more, right, as a result of their overseas Chinese status? And this is where I shift to the second portion that I mentioned, the narratives and experiences of these remigrant women who are seeking a new home. I conducted interviews with remigrant women in the southeastern Chinese provinces of Fujian and Guangdong because these were the main sending provinces, and also because, to be honest, this is where the alumni in Malaysia and Singapore had connections. So interestingly, the Nanyang Girls High School Alumni Association in Singapore connected me with their chapter in Fuzhou, and then going there, that's where I met some women to talk to. Any social scientists amongst you will know that this is not anything like a representative sample size, but this was the only way to kind of hear their voices and hear their experiences. One thing that I found in talking to these women was that there were certain commonalities, three main ones. One, the difficulty they faced in assimilating into Chinese society, not just for a short period, but for their entire lives. Second, the way in which they did not identify themselves as feminists. They didn't identify themselves as fighters for gender equality. Rather, they identified themselves first and foremost as patriots. And third, how girls' schools, Chinese girls' schools, opened the door practically for them to make this journey, but later also restricted their opportunities. I'll go a little more quickly here because I want to make sure I leave time for Q&A. But just to give you a sense for how these interviews worked out, as you can imagine, this is still a fairly sensitive topic in China, this question of returned overseas Chinese and what their fates were. So when I applied to go to China, throughout the time that I was interviewing people, whether individually or in group settings, I always had an escort with me, a chaperone. Okay, that person was my guide, but of course it meant that there was always someone official sitting in on these conversations. Therefore, they did not necessarily flow as freely or as openly as possible. And also, one must bear in mind that there were some returnees who did have positive experiences. And so when I asked them generally, did you have a good career? How are your children doing? And so on and so forth. They would say things like, this has just been great. Everything has gone smoothly. The word regret has never even floated across my mind, right? 从没浮过我的脑海, just not even a consideration. But bearing in mind all of these ambivalences that are still there, people found ways to convey or hint at the personal sacrifices they made. To a person, every single one of them talked about how they lost touch with their family and their friends in Malaysia and Singapore, right? And more often than not, this was not voluntary. So even letters, let alone, what do they call it? Sending money, right? All of these things, remittances, these were not a good idea because they could get the overseas Chinese, already suspect in China, into even more trouble. For some of them, the suffering was not just on their own part, but on their children's part. One woman described how she was sent down for a short while, but her daughter, who was in ill health, was also sent down as a consequence, simply because she was related to an overseas Chinese. Some individuals, the severance of their ties with Southeast Asia was much more permanent than they ever thought it would be in their youth. There was one group interview session where I met a woman named Cai Jianyu, and she was very quiet. She didn't have much to say throughout the conversation. And then at the end of the conversation, she kind of came up to me and she slipped this newspaper article into my hand, and she said, "Here's something I wrote. This is my story. Why don't you take a look?" She had actually participated quite voluntarily and enthusiastically, as a young politically activist Chinese student. But she was very sad to not have had contact with her family in Singapore, I think it was. And after all these decades, when she was finally allowed to return to see her parents, her mother had dementia and actually had no idea who she was. And this is not an unusual story for many of these returnees. Cai Jianyu was unusual in that she actually wrote an article that was published in a newspaper. So it's interesting on two accounts. One is just the story that it tells, right? The emotion of it, the tragedy of it. And second, it was published in a newspaper. It tells you that there were perhaps windows of time when these kinds of accounts could be given in public, and then yet others when it becomes politically inexpedient to talk about them, okay? Some other interviewees were just openly angry about what they had gone through, they didn't care anymore, and they would speak very openly. One of the other women I talked to was someone named Tang Li Jin. She's the woman on the right. The picture on the left is not of her, but of a Malayan Chinese communist guerrilla from the Malayan Communist Party, effectively a guerrilla force that resisted first the Japanese and then the British during the Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960. So Tang Li Jin was one of these guerrilla fighters. She actually saw gun battle. She wasn't just cooking and rendering first aid, as many women have been kind of compelled to do when they participate on the front. She was actually right there on the front lines, and so her revolutionary credentials, you can imagine, were quite impeccable. And yet, when she came to China, she was one of those people who was investigated, so to speak, suspected of not being truly loyal to the cause, and rehabilitation, official rehabilitation, did not happen until the late 1980s. And that has consequences. It sounds just like, a formality, but if you are not rehabilitated, that has implications for how much pension you can receive, if you had a certain job. So it has implications for you, your economic circumstances, and your family, right? Not just your social standing. Not only that, Tang Li Jin eventually brought her family over. She wanted to try and keep the family unit together. Her parents came because they needed her to look after them, but they were quite furious with her. They actually held her responsible, they said, for breaking up the family. So there you go, someone who had fought literally and figuratively to establish an authentic sense of home and belonging, eventually lost both her personal home as well as her home within the nation. Understandably, she was quite resentful and angry about that and did not fear to speak plainly. So despite having to hew to certain state-sanctioned narratives in an official capacity, many of these women found ways to express their personal ambivalence and sometimes regret. They were also very clear that their actions were driven by love of country, 爱国, by patriotism. I made what I guess I would consider a rookie interviewee mistake in that I started out using my own models and frameworks for trying to understand what my interviewees went through. So I thought, well, girls' school, doing unusual things for women in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, and then now, independent, strong women. Equality, gender equality, right? That must have featured into their self-perception. But when I put that forward, I was actually met with quite a bit of scorn. They said, no, we've actually, and this is an interesting phrase, we've passed the May 4th moment. May 4th movement was from an episode in 1919 where young students there was a movement for modernity and young women as well as men called for rights and so on. That's a very old reference. That's an almost 100-year-old reference. But these women felt impatient with this idea that they were somehow landing a blow for feminism. They said, no, this has nothing to do with that. We didn't even think about it. We just assumed that we were already of equal stature with the men. What we needed to fight for, what we needed to prove was our patriotism. That's what we were driven by. So that's another interesting thing to consider, given that the Chinese girls' schools offered practical as well as figurative opportunities, doors, for them to take the actions that they did. Without going too deeply into the dynamics of the Chinese girls' schools, it suffices to mention that many of the staff, the teachers, the principals, the school materials that they used, the textbooks, the curricula, came from China in the early years, so much so that the government very quickly began to pay attention to these schools and tried to change that particular feature. They worried that in Chinese girls' schools, you would have this hotbed of Chinese nationalism that would cause trouble. For these girls' schools and these women, they actually found that indeed teachers, extracurricular activities, lessons that they learned would sometimes give them the opportunity to explore beyond the confines that their families had set for them. So for example, you might have a friendly teacher who would stay after class and talk about her own experiences being politically active in China. She might talk about China's war effort, right? And kind of not necessarily tell them directly, you should go, you should join, but I think paint a very attractive picture and say, I know people who are going if you want to talk to them and learn more about it. That was definitely something that happened. Or you might have extracurricular activities in societies that became excuses, if you will, for girls spending time outside of their homes. They would tell their parents, for example, I'm going to choir practice or I'm going to volleyball practice. And then in fact, they would meet up with some of their other classmates, and come up with plans or activities in order to support the China war effort. Obviously this plays into certain kinds of stereotypes about Chinese schools being hotbeds of Chinese nationalism. I want to make sure that we're not lapsing into that particular stereotype. But this is just to point out that girls' schools and education were very much responsible for opening a new vista for these young women. And it was there both on the sending and the receiving ends. Because if you think about what was permissible, what was acceptable for a young woman to do outside the home, school was one of the first things, both in Malaya and Singapore, and then upon arrival in China, they could go to the universities there and immediately have some place to belong in that society, okay? So this is where I want to just pause because I know I have gone in many different directions. In a way, this is a microcosm of this book project. It was both very exciting, very enjoyable, and also incredibly challenging to try to pull all of these threads together and make it one thing, to find an overarching theme that could run across the entire book. I titled it Schooling Diaspora, not just because it was a history of girls' schools among the overseas Chinese, but I also wanted to think about schooling as a verb, right? How is it that you teach? How is it that you socialize? How is it that you form young people, young women, identities, whether it's ethnic, cultural, or political? So more than half a century after their return to China, for the re-migrants, Bai Shutiao and her colleagues, her compatriots, have come to represent different things to different people. And you can say that very much about the different populations that I studied in this book. Bai Xuetiao and the other women are sometimes used as symbols of China's gravitational pull on its global diaspora. They can also be cautionary tales of youthful idealism gone awry, right? What seems like a really good idea when you're a student activist and you're 19 years old may seem very foolhardy and something that one regrets when one is in their 80s. Or, as has often been the case in Southeast Asia, it becomes another wrinkle in the long-running controversy over vernacular schools. Both in Singapore and Malaysia, the continued existence of Chinese language schools is considered politically sensitive and is something that people disagree about vis-a-vis the establishment of, say, a Malaysian identity or a Singaporean identity, right? Do these schools actually militate against that by encouraging people to focus on their linguistic and cultural differences? So as far as the gender dimension goes of these stories, right, again, remigrants were not just female, they were male and female, but when I look at the female students who participated in this movement, it seems that female education both opened the door for them by giving them this awareness of the political world, by giving them the language and the frameworks to think about belonging in a political sense, not just in a domestic sense, perhaps. And it prompted them to make non-traditional choices. It took them very far. It took them up to a certain point. What did they bump up against at that point? It became the limitations of what the nation state required, right? So ultimately, female education and emancipation did take place, but it only went so far. We do like to think in our present day of identity as something that we can claim and construct, that we have agency over, but in the end, we also have to acknowledge the limitations that our environment might place upon us. So coming full circle to this question of home, what then does it mean to have a home or to adore one's home? To love one's home. It raises the poignant question of whether home loves you back, and what you will do when you are in a diasporic population where the question or concept of home is akin to the concept of identity. For better or worse, it can shift, it can be changeable, and you cannot always control where it might be. It may even be the case that the act of homecoming is sometimes more gratifying and more promising at the point of departure and on the journey itself than upon arrival at one's destination. So here we have arrived at our destination in this talk. I will stop here and I will take any questions and comments very gladly. Thank you so much for your patience and thank you for listening.